how hard is it for veterans to transition to civilian life?
It's very hard. I mean, my case is one where it's hard to imagine somebody being set up for a better or smoother transition, right? When you think about a really soft landing, I mean, I left Afghanistan and went back to a job that was totally unlike being a military intelligence officer in Afghanistan. I went back to being a lawyer at a firm in Kansas City, where they had like bagels and donuts available in the conference room on Fridays. I mean, it was completely different. So, on paper, it should have been great. I was employed. I was married. My parents live here in Kansas City. I mean, I had a career, I had a wife, and I had my extended family all there. And that didn't change the fact that being deployed to a combat zone, being in the situations that I was in, changed my brain. And so that's like in the best possible example, right? And with the work that I do now, where I work a lot with homeless veterans and veterans who are struggling in a lot of different ways, one of the things we work on most is restarting that military to civilian transition back at day one, even if folks have been out for a long time. And when you think about it, let's say it wasn't somebody in my situation. Let's say it's somebody who they went into the military straight out of high school, which is the more common scenario, right? And during that time, they sustain some trauma, or maybe they don't. Maybe they don't deploy, nothing like that happens. But even then, after 4 years, they come back home and they're not surrounded by people who did anything like they did. Over the 4 years previous, they knew where most of their meals were coming from. They never had to go, they never had to go get a lease on an apartment. They may have chosen to, but they likely didn't have to. They knew where most of their meals were coming from. They never even had to go get like cable figured out. So when you layer over that, the feeling of separateness in a society where less than 1% of the population now serves in the military, and the possibility of having sustained some trauma during your time, now you're really complicating the ability to, re-enter civilian life.
And when you think about that, Jason, how much of that is the trauma of combat versus the trauma also of being in a high pressure situation all the time? One of the things you sort of, it's very evocative in your book, is just moving around in a combat zone in an alien place with a lot of threats is pretty stressful. You don't have to be shot at to be pretty stressed. I mean, that's got to be something that that creates some invisible burdens that particularly folks on the at home don't necessarily understand.
Yeah, and that's one of the big things I tried to get across in the book, right? Because that was my experience, the one you're describing. I came home and was convinced for 10 years that whatever was going on with me could not be attributed to my deployment because I never fired my weapon over there. And in my mind, like, that didn't count. Now, what I had to do some work to finally accept was the idea that, as an intelligence officer who was going out and gathering this information, I was spending hours at a time in the most dangerous place on the planet, just me and my translator most of the time, meeting with people who, were unsavory characters of questionable allegiance. So, nearly every day there was the reasonable possibility of walking into a trap and getting killed. And so it took me a long time to accept the idea that even though I didn't fire my weapon, that as a clinical social worker at the VA put it to me, that didn't make me less of a combat veteran, that I had been exposed to all this danger every single day. And that changed my brain. And, toward the end of the book, one of the things I kind of come to is the idea that I have experienced something. I know what something is like that most Americans thankfully don't know what it's like. And one is the raw physical fear of being killed violently, like a reasonable, this might actually happen fear. You don't process it as fear at the time because you're too busy, doing your job, but it's in there. And then
also not getting killed. I mean, you there's that, yeah. I remember very vividly the scene where you're looking at the door behind the person, you put your armor down, you're in an uncertain place, you've got a sidearm, other folks don't. There are other people with AK-47s. Just because you don't fire the weapon, and that's you're processing not just fear but challenge at a very high level of stress. That's got to have a long tail.
Yeah, and that's the other piece. That so it's the first is that that raw physical fear of a reasonable chance of being killed. But the second is what you're talking about, which is, and what we always underestimate, which is, several times a week and sometimes more than once a day, preparing your mind to take another human life, whether you do or not. It doesn't leave you completely unchanged, right? I mean, to just go right back to like, I'm going to write a legal memo, turns out not a reasonable expectation for me to make of myself.